The visit of the CIA director to Moscow triggered a wave of alarming actions from the Kremlin. Just one visit by John Ratcliffe and immediately three countries respond in completely different ways. Vladimir Putin signs 3 secret decrees, which may also mention mobilization in the fall. Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko unexpectedly announced a sudden check of troop combat readiness today. And in Russia itself, the FSB and the National Guard are conducting exercises to repel an invasion in the Leningrad region. Essentially, Vladimir Putin is using these agencies for war. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, the American president, commenting on all this, calls his CIA director's visit to Moscow routine, but adds that maybe something will come out of it. He says nothing serious was discussed, but maybe something will work out. Then the question is, why was it necessary to send a huge military plane to Moscow if nothing serious was discussed? Let's break down in as much detail as possible what exactly happened and what versions of the events analysts on both sides, in the US and in Russia, are currently discussing. Since the Kremlin has already stated that Vladimir Putin supposedly did not meet with the CIA director yesterday, but for some reason cancelled all his plans for the entire day. My name is Oleg Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video and leave any comment you like. So, as you already know, the CIA director John Ratcliffe visited Moscow the other day. Today, Kremlin press secretary Dmitry Peskov told journalists that Vladimir Putin was informed about the visit of the CIA director to Moscow, but he himself allegedly did not meet with him. According to Peskov, there were only contacts between the intelligence services. When asked what topics were discussed during the talks on Tuesday, Peskov did not answer. At the same time, he called the contacts positive, through the channels of Russian and US intelligence services. But he added, quote, "These contacts often continue even during the most difficult moments of bilateral relations. But how much this will affect the overall process of bringing our bilateral relations out of the deep crisis they are in is still too early to say." Separately, Peskov emphasized that contacts between the Kremlin and representatives of the US president's administration are not planned at this time. Quote, "I repeat once again, Ratcliffe had no contacts with the Kremlin. I can't speak for other agencies. As for the Kremlin, no contacts are planned at this time." I would like to note that the trip of the director of the US Central Intelligence Agency, Ratcliffe, was the first known visit of the head of the American Intelligence Service to the Russian capital since then, since Ratcliffe's predecessor, William Burns, held talks with Putin in November 2021. But even journalists from the Kremlin pool stated yesterday that Vladimir Putin cancelled a whole series of events for the day when the CIA director landed in Moscow. But Peskov says, come on, Putin didn't meet with him. Donald Trump also tried to lower expectations today. Answering a journalist's question about whether CIA director Ratcliffe went to Moscow to discuss a possible war between Russia and NATO, or US sanctions against Iran, Trump stated that the trip was not related to any of these issues. Here is his quote. "None of the above. I hate to disappoint people, but he was there, I would say, for very routine reasons." But later Trump added that he still hopes that something from what Ratcliffe discussed in Moscow will help bring an end to Russia's war against Ukraine. And as usual, Trump added that if he were president, of course, Russia's war against Ukraine would not have happened. But on the ground, not just in statements, events are taking place that indicate the opposite. Something is clearly happening, and it's not something routine at all. The dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, ordered a sudden check of the country's armed forces' combat readiness amid Ratcliffe's visit to Moscow. The State Secretary of the Security Council of the Republic of Belarus, Alexander Wolfowicz, stated that as part of the inspection, one of the brigades will leave its permanent location and carry out a number of tasks. He noted that special attention will be given to methods of engaging a potential enemy with fire, taking into account the experience of military conflicts in Ukraine and Iran. According to him, the purpose of this entire event is to check the readiness of units and military formations for conducting combat operations under modern conditions. In addition, Wolfowicz urged people not to worry, quoting that nothing supernatural is happening. Earlier, the commander of the Special Operations Forces of the Belarusian Armed Forces, Alexander Ilukevich, stated that Minsk had begun forming a new airborne assault brigade near the border with Ukraine. The units are expected to be stationed in the Gomel area, but he also stated that really nothing terrible or supernatural is happening. The context of this combat readiness check becomes truly alarming if we recall an earlier report by the Wall Street Journal, which stated that Vladimir Putin began demanding that Alexander Lukashenko open a new front in Ukraine. In addition, according to the same publication, Moscow was planning to use Belarus for an operation against its neighbors, including for launching drones from the territory of Belarus. Against this backdrop, French President Emmanuel Macron personally called Lukashenko and warned him against getting involved in the war. And the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, drew attention to the construction of military infrastructure by Belarus along the Ukrainian border, which could be used for aggression against Kiev. At the same time as the inspection in Belarus, exercises are also taking place on Russian territory itself, near the borders with Finland and Estonia. In the Leningrad region, security forces conducted exercises called Commonwealth 2026 to prevent a possible invasion of Russian territory. Units of the Northwestern District of the Russian National Guard and officers of the Regional Border Department of the Federal Security Service took part in them. They practiced unit coordination, searching for, pursuing and detaining members of a simulated sabotage and reconnaissance group, who crossed the state border and also trained to block off the areas and routes they used to move. And in one of the videos presented by the National Guard, security forces drive up to a bus in a car, break its window and get on the bus, after which they lead the detainees out with a pistol held to their heads. In another video, these same Russian security forces conduct mortar fire at targets simulating the positions of a mock enemy. And the context of these exercises has also been building up for months. Here, the Kremlin is playing the long game. Back in May, the head of the FSB border service, Vladimir Kuleshov, accused Finland and Estonia of violating border agreements with Russia, stating that there has been an increase in provocative actions on their part. According to him, Finland is installing engineering barriers in places not provided for by the agreements, and Estonia is deviating from the agreements on the delimitation of water areas. Kuleshov stated that these initiatives create conditions for conflict situations and force Russia to prepare for various possible developments. At the end of June, the authorities of Murmansk Oblast, which borders Finland and Norway, reported activity by foreign sabotage and reconnaissance groups. At that time, checkpoints were set up on the region's roads and all trucks were thoroughly inspected with the help of service dogs. And starting from July 1, Russia closed the railway border crossings on the borders with Finland, Latvia and Estonia. The reasons for this decision were not specified. So basically, the Kremlin is systematically creating the impression that NATO is about to attack. And against this background, a logical question arises. Why did CIA Director John Ratcliffe come to Moscow? A number of experts today agree that the CIA Director conveyed certain signals and warnings to the Kremlin regarding the risks of war escalation and possible scenarios of escalation by Russia. A similar visit was made in November 2021 by Ratcliffe's predecessor William Burns, and at that time the head of the CIA secretly came to Moscow to warn Vladimir Putin against invading Ukraine. Later, Burns also met with the head of Russia's foreign intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin, in Turkey at the end of 2022. To convey details about that the use of tactical nuclear weapons was unacceptable. That was the period when the Russians were fleeing like rats from the Kherson and Kharkiv regions, when the armed forces of Ukraine were driving this trash off the whole Ukrainian land. And at that time Putin was confused, announced mobilization and threatened with nuclear weapons. But considering the current state of negotiations to end hostilities between Iran and the United States, plus the fact that Russia, together with China, are Iran's most important partners in terms of resources, one way or another. I also wouldn't rule out the possibility that Russia and China could potentially act as mediators in some matters. But still, the most convincing version seems to be the one voiced by the Wall Street Journal, about intelligence regarding preparations for mass mobilization in Russia and possible provocations against countries on NATO's eastern flank. It's not just about mobilization. Mobilization itself isn't really something that would greatly worry the White House, no. But mobilization is a prerequisite for escalation, and that does worry the White House. Mobilization can be used to build up forces in Donbass, or to free up reserves for a strike against the Baltic countries. In any case, it's an attempt to upset the balance and force the West either to raise the stakes or to abandon support for Ukraine. And Russia may use its mobilization resources for an attack or a hybrid provocation against the Baltic countries, Poland or Finland. And here you have an attempt to stir up the situation in Belarus and Leningrad, the Leningrad region. The bottom line. The official position of both Moscow and Washington is as down to earth as possible. They say it was a routine intelligence contact and there were no meetings with Putin. The subject of the talks is not being disclosed, but they say, don't worry, the CIA director just flies to Moscow on a military plane just to have a chat. Nothing more than that. But the reaction on the ground shows much greater concern. Belarus suddenly conducts a combat readiness check and redeploys a brigade. Russia is practicing repelling an incursion by a sabotage and reconnaissance group right at the Finnish and Estonian borders. Well, and experts agree that the visit of the CIA director, and not the usual negotiator Steve Witkoff, is in itself a signal that this was not about diplomacy, but about a stern warning against the backdrop of intelligence about preparations for mobilization and the possible provocation against NATO countries. I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye everyone. To be continued.